means to fight for themselves, to fight for the services that they need in order to make it in this country. So those resources might be money, it might be more classes, it might be trying to fight for changes in the law that would allow for them to bring their family members over. So that's why organization, when I talk about organizations, it's people coming together and forming groups, right? And saying this issue is important and we're going to fight for it. And that's how they become advocates for themselves and their community. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so if you guys then, going back to that metaphor about your teacher giving you a test, right? You would probably gather together, think about how you might address that and say, well, none of us have learned this. You haven't taught it to us this year. And so maybe a group of you might approach your teacher and explain to her and advocate for yourself and say, it doesn't make any sense for you to give us this test tomorrow, right? Because we haven't learned it yet. So you're speaking up for yourself. You're being your own advocates.
Next question.
Okay. How the refugees, have they changed or influenced the U.S.?
I'm sorry,
Speak up.
How the Indo-Chinese refugees changed or influenced the U.S.?
Oh, how did they change or influence the U.S.? Well, I think that they've taught us a lot about how a government can implement programs that can help people arrive here efficiently. Because, the case that I want to bring up is at Camp Pendleton, which is a Marine base here in California. It was the first one that was opened up as a refugee camp. And that camp received 50,000 Vietnamese and Cambodian refugees in 1975. And they helped resettle 50,000. But these Marines had like 36 hours or something like that to set up tents and to set up plumbing and find all the blankets and, how do they quickly receive like thousands of people? And they did it. They figured it out. And that was because the government decided that this was important, that South Vietnam was an ally and that we had a responsibility to help. And so I think one of the lessons that we've learned is that when governments care and they do the right thing, the outcome 40 years later, you can see, is a good one. The outcome is that Vietnamese Americans, Cambodian Americans, they've become Americans, right? And they continue to contribute to society. They continue to teach us about, what it means to be American and expand that definition so that we're not exclusive. So yeah, that's what I think. It's one of the biggest contributions.
Okay.
Okay, How was the experiences by Indo-Chinese refugees similar or different from other refugees?
So the term Indo-Chinese refugees was used early on because, and I want to turn it back to you guys and ask you actually, do you know where that term comes from, Indo-Chinese?
Kind of, because, right below China. Kind of right.
Yeah, so the three countries, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, used to be called French Indochina, right? Because they were colonized by France. And so that's why many people from those three countries can speak French. And the food also has some French influence, like we have baguettes in our Vietnamese sandwiches. But that term is now outdated. And so we, in the research and teaching fields, like to use the term Southeast Asian refugee because a lot of people are still mad about, French colonialism, meaning that France occupied Vietnam, took over the country, forced people to learn their language and the institutions, and that term was imposed on them. So, in Vietnam, no one ever uses the term Indo-Chinese to refer to us. It's usually from outside. And so it's about perspective. That's why we're actually called the Southeast Asian Archive and not the Indo-Chinese Archive, even though Indo-Chinese was an official term. Yeah. And also, there is a big organization in Washington, D.C. that used to be called the Indo-Chinese Resource Action Center, and they were huge advocacy organization. But then in the mid 1980s, when more refugees arrived and gave input, they changed their name to the Southeast Asia Resource Action Center. So just want to clarify that we typically prefer the term Southeast Asian, even though that sounds really broad, and there are a lot of countries in Southeast Asia beyond Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos.
Thank you.
And I know Indo-Chinese is more specific.
Yeah.
So your question was how the refugees...
How did
Can you repeat
this
that?
experience differ from like Germans or Italians or Chinese?
Like, how are the Southeast
Oh.
Asian refugees, how are their experiences different from, like, French, German, Irish, Chinese? How are their experiences different?
Or the same.
Oh, okay, that's a great question. I think, the very fundamental difference is that refugees are forced out of their homelands, right? Whereas we, even though there are immigrants who, feel like they have to leave to seek better opportunities and a better life elsewhere, refugees are displaced by political force, so meaning war, right? They're driven out by violence, and so there's a trauma that they carry with them, and that often gets passed on to the next generation. So in my work, I deal with a lot of, I've interviewed a lot of first-generation refugees, so people like my parents survived war, and they survived being displaced from their countries. And oftentimes they don't talk about it because it's too hard to talk about the memories and their experiences. And so they don't share it with their children, but somehow their children also inherit that silence and that trauma. So the comparison that I like to make is to what happened to the Jewish population during the Holocaust, right? And how it takes at least one or two generations later for people to be able to share their stories and deal with the past. So I think one of the main differences is that they're displaced by force, and they carry with them a lot of trauma. And then I think other immigrant groups, they're similar in the sense that, they have to come over here and deal and face a lot of discrimination. They tend to cluster into their own ethnic communities at first, because that's where they get all the support. So a lot of different similar patterns in terms of how they resettle and how they build their new lives. But I think the main difference is how they leave and the trauma that they carry with them.
Okay. So, how did, like, the Little Saigons influence, like, the American culture and the Southeast Asian refugees?
So Little Saigon, over here, we have a lot of different Little Saigons around the country, but this one that I am in is the largest, and it spans across 5 cities. It's really big. Have any of you been here to Southern California? To
No.
Orange County? Hopefully someday you can visit. And it's, at first it started out as one mall on a street, right? It was this mall that was built to look like a fancy pagoda and had like statues and lanterns and all of that. But eventually it grew to a lot of businesses, doctors' offices and restaurants and grocery stores. And now it spans across 5 cities. It's huge. And, people like to think that these, what we call ethnic enclaves, which is communities where people of the same ethnicity are clustered together. We tend to think of that as existing only for one generation. But then we see Chinatown and Little Tokyo and all these other places like that continue to be the center for the community. And I think what it contributes to America is that it shows how the U.S. is so diverse, full of so many vibrant cultures and food. Because food, I would say, is the main anchor for Little Saigon. People come from everywhere here for the food. And that's a very important part of identity, right, is your food. and that Little Saigons keep that alive, keep the food central to the identity, keep the language alive, because you can get, as you drive through Little Saigon, you see all the signs in Vietnamese, and you see all the businesses conducting their business in Vietnamese. And so, yeah, I think that really adds to the mosaic of American culture. And it shows that we can, share this culture with each other. And it's not about, this kind of zero-sum, if we have Vietnamese culture, then we take away from American culture. I think of it more as an enhancement to American culture, right? Because we know we're a land of immigrants, and we've had German and Italian and Polish immigrants here for centuries, and now we have newer arrivals who bring with them, I think, new knowledge, and I think force other Americans to think about how to embrace newer cultures and advance our understanding.
Okay. So, what is the most important thing that you think we should know?
Ooh, it's the most important thing. I think, well, first of all, I just want to commend you on this project. I think this is such a great project for you to learn about this history.
Mm-hmm.
So, good job.
Thank you.
I'm so happy and heartened when I see students, especially as young as you, exploring this topic, and always happy to help. I think the main takeaway would be how important stories are, right? So I shared with you a little bit of my story, and hopefully the way I shared it helped you to connect the dots a little bit. So I talked about these broad kind of historical events, right? And how governments and organizations responded. And these are all kind of facts that you can read about. But to really understand how history is lived and experienced, you have to talk to people.
Mm-hmm.
You have to get their perspective and, ask questions as you do about things like, how did they feel at the time? Oftentimes you can't get at the more interesting and complex aspect of history, like how it was experienced and how people felt. What did they sacrifice? How did they survive without being willing to sit down and listen to their stories? So,
Thank you.
Madison? Or Brady, you go.
Do you have any suggestions for further research or anyone we could talk to?
what do you plan on doing with the research? Will you be creating a website or doing
A website.
Okay. That's awesome. I hope you'll share it with me when you're done, so I can show it off. And also, we do this cool thing here at UCI. We do web archiving, which means that we crawl all of these important websites that have something to do with our history, so Southeast Asian refugee history, and then we preserve it. So that means that 100 years from now, someone could still find your website and the information on it. So I would love to do the web crawl on your website when it's done.
Yeah.
That sounds fun.
I think we just have probably in about a week it should be done. So
Ooh, awesome.
pretty soon.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then in terms of suggestions, I can send you. Have you been able to look at the Viet Stories
No, because we just got back from break.
webpage that we have here at UCI?
Not yet. I don't think so.
We just
Okay,
got back
I'll
from
send
break
you a
after
link
we got our
to look at that. It's we have 225 oral histories on there. So, like I mentioned, how important stories are. We've gathered all of these life stories from Vietnamese Americans themselves, and so they're talking about things like how did they escape Vietnam? How did they rebuild their lives in the U.S. So it's pretty cool.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for letting us interview you.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. And good luck. Good luck with getting the website done. Congratulations.
Thanks.
This is fabulous.
Thank you so much.
Thank
We'll get on
you.
the website and we'll get going on it.
Yep.